21-year-old Stephen Cameron was just going out to buy bagels with his fiancée. Kenneth Noye was heading to a pub gathering. Their paths should never have crossed. But when a red van and a Land Rover met on a slip road of the M25 that Sunday afternoon, fate had other plans. What followed was not just a murder, but the unraveling of one of Britain's most notorious criminals, a man who had literally gotten away with murder before, who had helped launder millions in stolen gold, and who believed he could do anything. This time he was wrong. Kenneth James Noye was born on May 24, 1947 in Bexleyheath, Kent, where his father ran a post office and his mother operated a dog racing track. From the very beginning there were signs that young Kenneth would not follow a conventional path. He was a bully at Bexleyheath Boys' Secondary Modern School, running protection rackets with other pupils, demanding money from younger kids in exchange for not beating them up. It was organized crime at its most basic level, but it showed something disturbing about the boy's character. He understood power, he understood fear, and he knew how to use both to his advantage. His dishonesty started even earlier than his school protection rackets. At just 5 years old, his mother caught him stealing money from a till in a Woolworth store while she had been talking to a shop assistant. Most parents would have been mortified, most children would have been ashamed, but Kenneth Noye was different. He learned from that experience not that stealing was wrong, but that he needed to be more careful about not getting caught. He left school at age 15, with no qualifications and limited prospects. Soon after, he was caught selling stolen bicycles after altering their appearance to disguise their origins. For this and other crimes, he spent a year in a Borstal, essentially a youth prison designed to reform young offenders. But Borstal didn't reform Kenneth Noye. Instead, it became his university of crime. He learned that the clever way to get rich from crime was not to do the robbery yourself, but to buy stolen goods cheaply from thieves and sell them on at a profit. He was learning to be a fence, a middleman, someone who could profit from crime while keeping his hands relatively clean. While in Borstal, Noye met Brenda Tremaine, a barrister's legal secretary who would later become his wife. It seems almost impossible, a legal secretary falling for a young criminal, but Noye had something that set him apart from other petty thieves. He had charm, ambition, and an ability to present himself as something more than he was. He could talk his way into and out of almost anything. After his release, Noye didn't go straight. Instead, he refined his criminal activities. He got a job as an apprentice printer in Fleet Street and sold stolen newspapers from a makeshift stall in the Strand at night. On Saturdays, he worked as a sales assistant at Harrods. He bought his first car, a convertible Ford Cortina, and realized the money-making potential of stolen car parts. For a year, he did a roaring trade selling stolen components to crooked car repair businesses. But Noye wasn't content with being a small-time crook. After training as a printer and breaking into the well-paid industry in Fleet Street, he worked night shifts while supplementing his income with truck driving during the day. He worked hard in pursuit of money. Eventually, he left the print world to start his own haulage company in West Kingstown, before expanding with building companies and getting involved in property deals, one of which reportedly netted him £300,000. This was the genius of Kenneth Noye. He understood that to be a successful criminal, you needed legitimate businesses as cover. His haulage company, his property deals, they all served a dual purpose. They made him look respectable while providing perfect vehicles for laundering money and moving stolen goods. By the early 1980s, Noye had established himself as a significant figure in the British criminal underworld. He became a Freemason in January 1980, joining the Hammersmith Lodge in London after being proposed for admission by 2 police officers, giving his occupation as builder. The membership of the lodge contained a sizable proportion of police officers. This connection to the Freemasons, and through them to police officers, would prove invaluable. He had been a police informant for many years, having begun connections with corrupt officers by the time he was arrested for receiving stolen goods in 1977. Think about that for a moment. Here was a career criminal who had managed to position himself as an informant to the very people who should have been arresting him. He was playing both sides, using his criminal connections to feed information to corrupt police officers, while using his police connections to stay one step ahead of the law. It was a dangerous game, but Kenneth Noye had always been a gambler. Then came November 26, 1983, a date that would change everything. At 6:30 a.m., a South London gang of 6 armed robbers, headed by Brian Robinson and Mickey McAv, broke into the Brinks Mat warehouse at Heathrow Airport, expecting to find about £3 million in cash. Inside help came from Anthony Black, a security guard who was living with Robinson's sister. Black's information gave the gang quick access, and they overpowered the guards, pouring petrol over them and threatening to set them alight to get the safe combination. But when they opened the safe, they didn't find cash. Instead, they found 6,800 gold bars worth £26 million, about £100 million in today's money. The robbers had stumbled upon one of the largest gold hauls in criminal history, and they had absolutely no idea what to do with it. This is where Kenneth Noye entered the picture. McAvoy had entrusted part of his share to associates Brian Perry and George Francis. Perry recruited Kenneth Noye, who was an expert in his field, to dispose of the gold. Finally, Noye's years of building connections, establishing businesses, and positioning himself as a crucial middleman were about to pay off in ways he could never have imagined. Noye melted down the bullion and recast it for sale, mixing in copper coins to disguise the source. It was a brilliant scheme. By changing the purity of the gold and recasting it into different shapes, he could sell it on the legitimate gold market without raising suspicions. Or so he thought. The problem with stealing £26 million worth of gold is that people notice. The insurance companies notice, the police notice, and once they start looking, they don't stop. Noye was placed under police surveillance as investigators began to close in on the network of criminals involved in handling the stolen gold. On the night of January 26, 1985, everything came to a head. While being investigated for his involvement in the crime, Noye fatally stabbed Detective Constable John Fordham, who was involved in the police surveillance of Noye, in the grounds of his home. DC Fordham and a colleague had moved into the garden and disturbed Noye's dogs, whose barking attracted Noye, who was armed with a knife. He attacked DC Fordham, stabbing him 10 times. Fordham died 2 hours later. Here's where the story takes an almost unbelievable turn. Noye claimed he had been attacked and killed Fordham in self-defense, and at the resulting trial, the jury found him not guilty of murder. He told the court he had been confronted by a masked man he thought was going to kill him, and that he had struck out in self-defense. His explanation was accepted by the Old Bailey jury, and he was acquitted of murder. Imagine being the family of DC Fordham. A police officer doing his job, conducting surveillance on a suspected criminal, is stabbed 10 times and dies. His killer walks free. As the jury filed out, Noye said to them, "Thank you. God bless you." He had literally gotten away with murder, but the police weren't done with Kenneth Noye. In 1986, Noye was found guilty of conspiracy to handle the Brinksmack gold, fined £500,000 plus £200,000 costs, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. When the jury found him guilty, he turned on them, snarling, "I hope you all die of cancer." The mask had slipped. The charming businessman, the man who had convinced a jury he killed in self-defense, revealed his true nature in that moment of rage. He served 7 years before being released in 1994. 7 years for helping to launder £26 million in stolen gold. 7 years during which the family of DC Fordham had to live with the knowledge that their loved one's killer was still alive, would one day walk free, and had never been properly punished for what he did. When Noye was released from prison in 1994, he should have learned his lesson. He was 47 years old, wealthy despite the fines, and could have disappeared into comfortable obscurity. But Kenneth Noye was not a man who learned lessons. He was a man who believed he was untouchable. After all, he had killed a police officer and walked free. He had been caught with stolen gold bars from the crime of the century and served just 7 years. In his mind, he could do anything, but rage, pure, uncontrolled rage, would be his undoing. On May 19, 1996, electrician Stephen Cameron and his fiancée Danielle Cable, 17, were driving from their home in Dartford to London to buy bagels. It was a simple Sunday outing, the kind of thing young couples do all the time. Stephen was 21 years old, had his whole life ahead of him. He was in love, planning a future with Danielle. They had no idea that their simple trip for bagels would end in tragedy. On the 19th of May 1996, Noye was involved in a road rage incident with 21-year-old motorist Stephen Cameron on a slip road of the M25 motorway in Kent. Noye stabbed Cameron to death with a 9-inch knife and immediately fled the country. What exactly happened on that slip road? The trial heard Noye had been on his way to a gathering at a pub when he was cut up by the red van Danielle was driving, sparking a fight on the slip road. On an M25 slip road near Swanley, Noye's Land Rover Discovery cut in front of Stephen's red van, which was being driven by Danielle. Stephen shook his head, before enraged Noye stormed over for a confrontation that saw him stab Stephen to death. Let's pause here and think about the absolute senselessness of this. A young man shakes his head at another driver. That's it. That's all Stephen Cameron did. He didn't threaten Noye. He didn't attack him. He shook his head in the universal gesture of driving frustration that happens thousands of times every day on roads around the world. And for that, Kenneth Noye decided he deserved to die. After a fight, Kenneth went back to his car to grab a knife. Kenneth stabbed electrician Stephen twice, penetrating the heart and liver, killing him almost instantly. Think about that sequence of events. There was a confrontation. Noye could have walked away. Instead, he went back to his car, retrieved a knife, and returned to kill Stephen Cameron. This wasn't a moment of passion. This was a decision, a choice. A calculation made by a man who had killed before and gotten away with it. Alan DeCabrel had testified at Noye's trial that he saw the fight between Noye and Cameron on the motorway slip road, and told the jury that he saw Noye lunging forward with a knife and stabbing Cameron. DeCabrel described how Noye calmly walked past his car during the attack, adding, "As he walked past my car, he nodded to me as if to say, 'That sorted him out, you've got yours, mate.'" That detail, the nod to a witness, tells you everything about Kenneth Noye's state of mind. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't in shock at what he'd done. He was satisfied. He had put someone in their place, taught them a lesson, shown them who was boss. The fact that the lesson was death, that the price of disrespecting Kenneth Noye was your life, didn't seem to bother him at all. Danielle Cable, Stephen's fiancée, was right there. She watched the man she loved die on the side of the M25. She was 17 years old. 17. The sole witness to the murder, Cameron's fiancée Danielle Cable was forced to change her identity and go into hiding after giving evidence which helped convict Noye in court. Her life, as she knew it, ended that day just as surely as Stephen's did. The killer immediately fled the country. He fled the country with assistance from Palmer, who later claimed to have barely known Noye. John Palmer, nicknamed Goldfinger, was another criminal who had been involved in the Brinksmat gold laundering. Despite his claims of barely knowing Noye, Palmer was instrumental in helping Noye flee the country following his fatal stabbing of Stephen Cameron. According to a book published recently in which Noye explained how he evaded capture, Palmer arranged for a helicopter to get him across the channel. Noye then traveled in a private jet out of Paris, then to Madrid and Tenerife. This wasn't a panicked flight. This was organized, planned, funded. Noye had money, connections, and a network of criminals willing to help him escape justice. Police initially named Anthony Francis as the man they wanted to question in the Cameron murder. By December 1996, however, this name was found to be a false identity used by Noye after the Land Rover Discovery registered in his name was unloaded in Kyrenia, Cyprus, in July that year. For months, police were chasing a ghost, a man who didn't exist, while Kenneth Noye was living comfortably in Spain. Meanwhile, back in England, the hunt for Stephen Cameron's killer was intensifying. While Noye was on the run, Detective Constable John Donald was jailed for 11 years for passing confidential information to him. A police officer, someone sworn to uphold the law, was feeding information to a murderer on the run. This is how deep Noye's corruption went, how far his tentacles reached into the very institutions meant to stop people like him. The investigation into Stephen Cameron's murder revealed something crucial about Kenneth Noye. He was not the master criminal he thought he was. He was a violent thug who happened to have money and connections. When faced with the slightest disrespect, the smallest challenge to his authority, he responded with lethal violence. He couldn't control his temper, couldn't walk away from a confrontation, couldn't let things go. For 2 years, Noye lived as a fugitive. A police hunt assisted by GCHQ found Noye in Spain, where he was arrested in the resort of Barbate near Gibraltar on 28 August 1998. GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, Britain's intelligence and security organization, was involved in tracking down a road rage killer. That's how seriously the British government took this case. This wasn't just about catching a murderer. This was about showing that no one, no matter how wealthy, how connected, how clever they thought they were, could kill with impunity in Britain. Cameron's girlfriend Danielle Cable, who witnessed the killing, was secretly flown out to positively identify him, which she did on 27 August. Imagine being Danielle Cable in that moment. 2 years after watching your fiancé murdered, you're flown in secret to Spain to look at the man who killed him and confirm his identity. The courage that must have taken is almost unimaginable. Having fled the country, Noye was tracked down to Barbate, Spain, and Danielle traveled there with police to identify him in a restaurant. She had to walk into a restaurant, look at Kenneth Noye, and identify him as the man who had destroyed her life. All while knowing that this man had killed before, had connections to organized crime, and had already demonstrated that he would kill anyone who got in his way. Noye lost an appeal against his extradition from Spain 7 months later. He was extradited to Britain in May 1999, 9 months after his arrest, and went on trial 10 months later. The legal process was slow, methodical, careful. The authorities knew they were dealing with someone who had escaped justice before. They couldn't afford any mistakes. At trial, Noye claimed not to be a violent man and again pleaded self-defense, claiming to have fled because the police hated him and he feared not receiving a fair trial. The same defense that had worked when he killed D.C. Fordham, the same claim of self-defense, the same portrayal of himself as the victim, but this time things were different. This time there were witnesses who hadn't been intimidated into silence. This time the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the eyewitness testimony of Danielle Cable, who provided detailed accounts of the incident, identifying Noye as the perpetrator. Physical evidence, including the flick knife, also played a vital role in supporting the prosecution's narrative. The evidence presented pointed to a premeditated and deliberate act of aggression. Found guilty on 14 April 2000, after a trial held in conditions of high security, Noye was convicted of murder by the jury's majority verdict of 11-1 after their deliberations had lasted 8 hours and 21 minutes, and was given a life sentence by Lord Justice Latham. Finally, justice, 4 years after Stephen Cameron's death, his killer was convicted, but even then, Kenneth Noye couldn't accept responsibility. He appealed his conviction multiple times. On 10 October 2001 and again in 2004, Noye appealed unsuccessfully against his conviction. On 14 October 2010, Noye was granted a fresh appeal against his conviction for Cameron's murder, but it was rejected on 22 March 2011. The tragedy of Stephen Cameron's murder extends beyond his death. Another eyewitness in the Cameron murder, Alan DeCabrel, declined protection and was shot dead in his car in front of shoppers through his open window in Ashford, Kent, on 5 October 2000, some 6 months after Noye's conviction. Police sources were in no doubt that DeCabrel was killed by a professional hitman. The witness had already warned he feared for his life, saying 3 bullets had been shoved through his letterbox as a threat. He admitted he was terrified after being told by gangsters to shut up or we will shut you up. His fears proved right when he was executed on the streets of Ashford, in what police believe was a professional hit. Was Noye responsible for DeCabrel's murder? Police concluded that the unsolved murder had no proven connection with Noye and did not charge him. Now, 25 years later, Noye has spoken for the first time to deny he had anything to do with the killing. When confronted at his £500,000 penthouse in Sevenoaks by a reporter from the Daily Mail, the 78-year-old snapped, "Fancy coming here and asking me that. Do you know where I was? In F***ing prison, now F** off." But whether or not Noye ordered the hit, the message was clear. Testify against Kenneth Noye and you might pay with your life. The climate of fear he had created extended beyond prison walls. The impact on the Cameron family was devastating. Kenneth Cameron, whose son Stephen was stabbed to death on an M25 slip road at Swanley, tragically died in hospital. Stephen Cameron was just 21 when he was killed by gangster Kenneth Noye in the brutal roadside attack in 1996, leaving his parents grief-stricken. His heartbroken father Kenneth, known as Ken, suffered another devastating loss in 2016 when his wife Toni died. Following the father's death, a source told the Mirror, Noye has Kenneth's blood on his hands. The ripples of violence spread outward, destroying not just the direct victims but their families, their loved ones, everyone touched by the senseless brutality of one man's rage. The trial of Kenneth Noye for the murder of Stephen Cameron began on March 30, 2000, at the Old Bailey in London. Almost 4 years had passed since that terrible Sunday on the M25. 4 years during which Danielle Cable had lived in hiding, during which the Cameron family had mourned without closure, during which Kenneth Noye had enjoyed the sunshine in Spain while a young man lay in his grave. The prosecution painted a clear picture of what happened that day. Noye was involved in a road rage incident with 21-year-old motorist Stephen Cameron on a slip road of the M25 motorway in Kent. Noye stabbed Cameron to death with a 9-inch knife and immediately fled the country. The case was simple. This was murder, pure and simple. A man who couldn't control his temper had killed an innocent young electrician over nothing more than a traffic dispute. Noye's defense was predictable. He pleaded self-defense, the same defense that had worked when he killed D.C. Fordham 15 years earlier. He claimed he had been threatened, that he feared for his life, that Stephen Cameron had been the aggressor. It was a calculated strategy: paint the victim as the villain, make the jury doubt, create just enough uncertainty to escape justice once again. But this time was different. This time there was Danielle Cable. The sole witness to the murder, Cameron's fiancée Danielle Cable, was forced to change her identity and go into hiding after giving evidence which helped convict Noye in court. Think about what that means. A 17-year-old girl watches her boyfriend murdered and then has to give up everything: her name, her home, her family, her friends, her entire life, just to see justice done. The courage it took for Danielle to testify cannot be overstated. The unprecedented decision to ask Danielle if she would participate in an undercover operation to pick out Noye. Mr. Biddis said, "I went to see Danielle. I had already warned her that it may well be necessary for her to go out, and she was up for it, but her mum wasn't." Before the trial even began, Danielle had already shown extraordinary bravery. A few days later, the police chief got a call from his team saying they had identified Noye, but he could not order his arrest as his officers had no authority in Spain. It was then he made the unprecedented decision to ask Danielle if she would participate in an undercover operation to pick out Noye. She flew to Spain, walked into a restaurant where Kenneth Noye was sitting, and identified him as the man who had murdered Stephen Cameron. She did this knowing that Noye had killed before, knowing that he had connections throughout the criminal underworld, knowing that by identifying him she was putting her life at risk. At trial, Danielle's testimony was devastating. She described in detail what she had seen, how Noye had approached their van, how the confrontation had escalated, how Noye had returned to his vehicle to get the knife, and how he had deliberately and coldly stabbed Stephen twice before walking away. Her evidence was clear, consistent, and compelling. Noye was found guilty on the 14th April 2000. He was given a life sentence with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 16 years. The jury's majority verdict of 11-1 came after deliberations lasting 8 hours and 21 minutes. Finally, justice, but at what cost? For Kenneth Noye, the conviction was unacceptable. He couldn't believe that he, the man who had gotten away with killing a police officer, who had survived the Brinksmat investigation relatively unscathed, had been brought down by a teenage girl's testimony. He appealed immediately and would continue appealing for years, but for Danielle Cable, the conviction brought no freedom. Such was the perceived danger to her life that for almost 25 years she has been forced to live in witness protection under an assumed identity. She couldn't return to her old life. She couldn't be Danielle Cable anymore. She had to become someone else entirely, living under an assumed name, unable to see her family except on rare, carefully controlled occasions. As for Danielle, while Noye is free, she is not. She remains in witness protection and is only allowed to see her parents twice a year, 2 times a year, that's all. While Kenneth Noye served his sentence knowing he would one day walk free, Danielle Cable was serving a life sentence of her own, one imposed not by a court but by the need to stay alive. The ripple effects of Noye's violence continued to spread. Alan DeCabrel, the brave witness who had testified about seeing Noye stab Stephen Cameron, paid the ultimate price for his courage. 6 months after Noye's conviction, DeCabrel was shot dead in his car in Ashford, Kent. The execution-style killing bore all the hallmarks of a professional hit. The message was clear: testify against Kenneth Noye and you die. Meanwhile, the Cameron family was destroyed by grief. Ken said, "We wanted him to stay behind bars and pay for what he's done. He should serve life. He's never shown any remorse." Tony died after a short illness not long after, while Ken took a drug overdose at home in 2022. Both of Stephen's parents died without ever seeing their son's killer show a moment of genuine remorse for what he had done. The parole process for Kenneth Noye began in 2015, when he first became eligible for release after serving 15 years. The very idea that this man could walk free after everything he had done seemed obscene to those who knew the full extent of his crimes. He had killed a police officer and been acquitted. He had helped launder millions in stolen gold and served just 8 years. He had murdered Stephen Cameron in cold blood and might now walk free after just 16 years. Noye was refused permission to move to an open prison by Justice Secretary Michael Gove in October 2015 after such a move had been recommended. However, in the High Court, Mr. Justice Lavender accepted a legal challenge in February 2017 that Gove had failed to give proper or adequate weight to the recommendation of the parole board. The legal battles continued. Edward Fitzgerald QC, acting for Noye, said during the previous month's hearing that the board had noted that he had made significant progress in changing his attitudes and tackling his behavioral problems. Changed his attitudes, tackled his behavioral problems. This was a man who had killed 2 people and shown no genuine remorse for either death. It was announced in August 2017 that Gove's successor David Liddington had agreed Noye should be moved to open prison conditions. Around March 2018, Noye was moved to HM Prison Stanford Hill on the Isle of Sheppey, which is a low-security prison with a day release provision for prisoners. And then came the news that the victims' families had been dreading. In May 2019, the parole board announced that Noye was suitable for return to the community and would be released from prison within about 3 months. On 6 June 2019, then aged 72, Noye was released from prison after serving 20 years for the M25 attack. The parole board's reasoning was almost insulting in its bureaucratic language. The panel heard how Noye was of good conduct and compliance in prison and had worked positively with officials dealing with his case. The parole board said Noye had demonstrated an ability to deal appropriately with potentially violent situations in prison and was clearly well motivated to avoid further offending in the community. Good conduct in prison, what choice did he have? He was a 72-year-old man surrounded by younger, stronger criminals who knew exactly who he was and what he had done, working positively with officials. Of course he did, it was his only path to freedom. None of this meant he had changed, that he felt remorse, that he understood the magnitude of what he had done. The Ministry of Justice said, "We understand this will be a distressing decision for the family of Stephen Cameron and our thoughts remain with them." Like all life sentence prisoners released by the Independent Parole Board, Kenneth Noye will be on license for the remainder of his life, subject to strict conditions, and faces a return to prison should he fail to comply. On license for the remainder of his life. It sounds impressive until you realize what it actually means. According to the Mail Online, Noye is now living in a 1-bed flat in Sevenoaks, Kent. He's free. He can walk the streets, go to the shops, eat in restaurants, see his family. All the things that Danielle Cable cannot safely do. The grotesque unfairness of this situation became even clearer when news emerged of how Noye viewed his victim's testimony. He added, "She gave honest evidence at the trial. I have no issue with her. I am truly sorry for her loss, and I am glad she has moved on with her life. She may not believe me, but I do want to say this. I am not a danger to her in any respect. I was never a danger to her, and there was never a £1,000,000 price on her head, as the police suggested. She should be able to fully enjoy her family and friends because there are no threats to her from me. There never was. I am devastated at Stephen's death and the circumstances around it. These words, published in 2023, ring hollow. If Noye was truly devastated by Stephen's death, why did he flee the country? Why did he fight extradition? Why did he appeal his conviction multiple times? Why did he never, in all those years, simply admit what he had done and express genuine remorse? The recent glorification of Kenneth Noye in popular culture has added insult to injury for the victims' families. Kenneth Noye is a notorious British gangster and thief who features in the BBC true crime drama series The Gold, which follows the 1983 Brinksmat heist. Jack Lowden plays the charismatic career criminal in the show, but Noye's real victims have criticized the performance for glamorizing the gangster. The series was condemned by Gary Cameron, the uncle of Stephen Cameron, who Noye killed years after his involvement in the robbery. Cameron hit out at the BBC for portraying Noye as some kind of a good guy when he is a cold-blooded murderer. Even more disturbing was Noye's reaction to his portrayal. Cornwall Live reported that one of the gangster's friends claimed Noye was over the moon with Lowden's performance, and that following the show people approached Noye in the street and asked to shake his hand. People want to shake hands with a double murderer because they saw him portrayed sympathetically on television. This is what happens when we turn criminals into celebrities, when we forget that behind every true crime drama are real victims, real families destroyed, real lives ended. Former Detective Superintendent Nick Bittis, who led the investigation into Stephen Cameron's murder, remains clear-eyed about who Kenneth Noye really is. Former Detective Superintendent Nick Bittis called him a career criminal who has no compunction to use violence. Bidis added, "This man has lived his life by crime, violence, threats, doesn't give a damn about anyone other than himself. He left Stephen dying in the gutter, giving him no help. He has left a trail of devastation. People like him who are career criminals, if they commit heinous crimes, they shouldn't come out." The detective who arrested Noye understands something that the parole board apparently did not. Some people are simply too dangerous to ever be truly free, not because they might reoffend, though that's always a possibility, but because their very presence in society is an affront to justice, a message that if you're clever enough, connected enough, patient enough, you can literally get away with murder. The story of Kenneth Noye is often told as a crime story, a tale of robbery and murder and eventual justice. But that misses the real tragedy at its heart. This is a story about the price of standing up to evil, about the cost of doing the right thing, about how our justice system can fail those it's meant to protect while showing mercy to those who have shown none. Consider the mathematics of justice in this case. Kenneth Noye served 7 years for his role in laundering £26 million in stolen gold. He served 0 years for killing DC John Fordham. He served 20 years for murdering Stephen Cameron. That's 27 years in prison for 2 murders and one of the biggest crimes in British history. Meanwhile, Danielle Cable has served 27 years and counting in witness protection, unable to live a normal life, seeing her parents twice a year, always looking over her shoulder. Although Noye got a life sentence for murder, the risk of him exacting revenge meant she had to live under the witness protection scheme, change her appearance and move to a safe house far away from her family and friends in Kent. She gave up everything to see justice done, and even now, with Noye supposedly reformed and claiming she has nothing to fear from him, she cannot reclaim her life. The witness protection program saved Danielle Cable's life, but it also stole it from her. She has since married and has reportedly had a baby, but these milestones, marriage, motherhood, have all happened under an assumed identity, cut off from her past, unable to share her joy with many of the people who knew and loved her as Danielle Cable. She said that Christmas and birthdays are lonely times, says Terry, but she's got a new job and friends and is happy. Despite the dramatic change to her life, she doesn't regret getting justice for Stephen. She doesn't regret it, but the cost has been almost unbearable. While Kenneth Noye spent his years in prison knowing he would one day walk free, Danielle Cable has spent those same years knowing she might never be truly free again. The parallels between the 2 murders Kenneth Noye committed are striking and revealing. In both cases, he claimed self-defense. In both cases, he used a knife. In both cases, the victims were unarmed. In both cases, Noye was the one who escalated the situation to violence. The difference was that in 1985, when he killed DC Fordham, there were no independent witnesses brave enough to contradict his version of events. In 1996, when he killed Stephen Cameron, there was Danielle Cable. One teenage girl's courage made all the difference. Without her testimony, Kenneth Noye would have gotten away with murder twice. He knew this, which is why the intimidation campaign against witnesses was so fierce, why Alan DeCabrel ended up dead, why Danielle Cable has had to spend the rest of her life in hiding. The murder of Alan DeCabrel deserves special attention because it shows how the violence Noye initiated continued to ripple outward even after his conviction. DeCabrel was a man who simply did the right thing. He witnessed a murder and testified about what he saw. For this act of civic duty, he was executed in broad daylight. His murder remains officially unsolved, but everyone knows why he died. He died because he stood up to Kenneth Noye. The message his murder sent was chilling and clear. Even if Kenneth Noye is in prison, his reach extends beyond bars. Even if you think you're safe, you're not. Even if the law protects you, it can't protect you enough. This is the reality of organized crime, the truth that crime dramas rarely show. The bad guys don't always lose, the witnesses don't always survive, and justice always comes at a price. The parole board considered risks associated with his release due to his readiness to carry and use weapons, and because Noye was not being able to resolve arguments reasonably at key moments, as he did not always control extreme emotions well. The board concluded that any perceived risks could be managed in the community, and thus he was suitable for release. Read that again. The parole board acknowledged that Noye had a readiness to carry and use weapons, that he couldn't resolve arguments reasonably, that he didn't control extreme emotions well. These are exactly the characteristics that led him to murder Stephen Cameron, yet somehow they concluded these risks could be managed in the community. How exactly do you manage someone's readiness to carry weapons? How do you manage their inability to control extreme emotions? You can't. You can only hope that age has mellowed them, that the years in prison have taught them something, that they won't kill again. Hope is not a strategy for public safety. Kenneth Noye is now 78 years old, living in his flat in Sevenoaks, presumably enjoying his remaining years in freedom. He has outlived both of Stephen Cameron's parents, who died broken-hearted. He has outlived Alan DeCabrel, who was murdered for telling the truth. He has outlived DC John Fordham, who was just doing his job. He has outlived the justice system's attempt to keep him locked away. But he hasn't outlived the memory of what he did. He hasn't outlived the trauma he inflicted on Danielle Cable, who still lives in witness protection nearly 3 decades later. He hasn't outlived the grief of the families he destroyed. He hasn't outlived the anger of those who believe he should have died in prison. The case of Kenneth Noye raises fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and redemption. Can someone who has killed twice ever truly be reformed? Should someone who has shown such callous disregard for human life ever be free to walk among us? Is 20 years enough punishment for taking a young man's life in a moment of rage? These questions don't have easy answers, but the facts of this case suggest that our justice system failed Stephen Cameron, failed his family, and failed Danielle Cable. It failed them by allowing Kenneth Noye to walk free after killing a police officer. It failed them by giving him a sentence that allowed for parole after just 16 years. It failed them by prioritizing his rehabilitation over their safety and peace of mind. The story of Kenneth Noye is not just a true crime story. It's a tragedy in the classical sense, a tale of how one man's hubris and violence destroyed multiple lives, how our systems of justice can fail those who need them most, and how the price of standing up to evil is often paid by the innocent. As I tell you this story as we near its end, I want you to think about Stephen Cameron, 21 years old, an electrician, engaged to be married, his whole life ahead of him. He died because he shook his head at another driver. That's it. That's all he did, and for that, Kenneth Noye decided he deserved to die. I want you to think about Danielle Cable, 17 years old when she watched the man she loved murdered in front of her. Now in her 40s, still in witness protection, still unable to reclaim her real name, her real life. She has spent more years in hiding than she had lived when Stephen was killed. Her courage in testifying against Noye was extraordinary, but the price she has paid for that courage is almost unbearable. I want you to think about DC John Fordham. A police officer doing his job, conducting surveillance on a suspected criminal, stabbed 10 times in someone's garden, his killer acquitted, walking free, going on to kill again. His family forced to live with the knowledge that justice was denied, that his death was deemed acceptable, that his killer faced no real consequences until he killed again. I want you to think about Alan DeCabrel, a witness who did his civic duty, who saw a murder and testified about what he saw. Shot dead in his car 6 months after Kenneth Noye was convicted, his murder unsolved but its message clear. Cross Kenneth Noye even by telling the truth and you die. And I want you to think about Kenneth Noye himself, not as the charismatic criminal portrayed in television dramas, not as the clever gangster who almost got away with it all, but as what he really is. A violent man who couldn't control his temper, who believed his life was worth more than others, who destroyed families and felt no real remorse. It should never have happened, said Noye. As I walk free, so should she. These recent words from Noye about Danielle Cable reveal the depth of his self-delusion. He walks free because he served his sentence. She remains in hiding because he created a situation where her life will always be in danger. He created this reality through his violence, his connections to organized crime, and his utter disregard for human life. The final insult is that Kenneth Noye has become something of a celebrity. People approach him in the street to shake his hand. He's portrayed in television dramas by charismatic actors. Books are written about him. He's transformed from a violent criminal into a cultural figure, a character in Britain's crime mythology. Every handshake, every dramatization, every moment of celebrity is a betrayal of his victim's memory. This is how our story ends, not with justice, because justice would require Stephen Cameron to be alive, would require Danielle Cable to be free, would require DC Fordham and Alan DeCabrel to have died of old age surrounded by their families. Not with redemption, because Kenneth Noye has shown no genuine remorse, no real understanding of the devastation he caused. Our story ends with a bitter truth. Sometimes the bad guys win, sometimes killers walk free. Sometimes witnesses pay a higher price than criminals, sometimes courage is punished more than cowardice, sometimes the system fails, but our story also ends with another truth. Sometimes one person's courage can make a difference. Danielle Cable's testimony put Kenneth Noye in prison. Her bravery ensured that Stephen Cameron's death was not forgotten, that his killer was punished, that some measure of justice was achieved. The price she paid was enormous, but without her courage, Kenneth Noye would have gotten away with murder twice. In the end, the story of Kenneth Noye and his victims is a reminder that evil exists, that it often wears a charming face, that it can destroy lives in an instant of rage. It's a reminder that standing up to evil requires extraordinary courage and often demands an enormous price. It's a reminder that justice is not perfect, that it sometimes fails, that it often comes too late and costs too much. Stephen Cameron died for shaking his head. DC John Fordham died for doing his job. Alan DeCabrel died for telling the truth. Danielle Cable lost her identity, her freedom, her life as she knew it for seeking justice. Their sacrifices should not be forgotten, should not be overshadowed by the glamorization of their killer, should not be diminished by his release from prison. Kenneth Noye may be free, but he is not innocent. He may be old, but he is not reformed. He may claim that Danielle Cable has nothing to fear from him, but his entire life has been built on violence and lies. The families he destroyed, the lives he ended, the fear he created, these are his true legacy. As you go about your life, remember Stephen Cameron. Remember that he was someone's son, someone's fiancé, someone's friend. Remember that he died for nothing, killed by a man who thought his rage was more important than another person's life. Remember Danielle Cable, who gave up everything to see justice done and who lives still with the consequences of Kenneth Noye's violence. This is not just a true crime story. This is a human story, a story about the best and worst of humanity, about courage and cowardice, about justice and its failures. It's a story that should make us angry, should make us sad, should make us think about what kind of society we want to live in and what price we're willing to pay for justice. Kenneth Noye is free, Danielle Cable is not. Stephen Cameron, DC John Fordham, and Alan DeCabrel are dead. These facts will not change, but by remembering their stories, by refusing to glamorize their killer, by honoring their courage and mourning their losses, we can ensure that Kenneth Noye's final victory is not complete. The M25 killer may walk free, but he walks in a world that knows what he did, that remembers his victims, that understands the true cost of his crimes. That knowledge, that memory, that understanding, perhaps that is the only justice left.